And here we are back again, our bi-weekly Freightonomics episode here. Zach Strickland, head of Freight Market Intelligence. Thomas Wasson.
I'm back.
You keep coming back, man. And
I feel like I've seen myself before.
I mean, my rotating round of co-hosts, as Dr. Rogers calls it here, back for more. And of course, Dr. Z will be joining us here shortly. But first off, Thomas Wasson, we are in the midst of August. Now, we've had some, it's hard to stay apolitical in this world, but I think once you start nosing your way into the data and the macroeconomic data, you start to have to kind of acknowledge its existence, whether or not you lean left or right or agree or disagree with that. I think there is this growing sentiment. And I heard Jim Cramer say this, Mad Money. For those of you that watch CNBC, you'll know what I'm talking about. He was like, yeah, I don't trust the data anymore.
No.
Like he's not going to, he literally says on the show, like, moving forward for previous reasons and now new reasons, he's now like not as trustworthy of this BLS data. Now, I think it's pretty well documented. The quality of the BLS data has been deteriorating because of the nature of how it's collected with an outdated survey mechanism that a lot of people no longer respond to. But that being said, I think I don't know that the data got it wrong necessarily as much. There's been a lot of revisions and, whatever they do with it moving forward. But even if the person that gets appointed there's now the question of, well, are they being truthful or not? And even if they are being truthful, you can't remove the question from the data.
Well, I mean, you don't want to also be the person who takes the job and you found out what happened to your predecessor.
Yeah.
We're talking about data collections. Jim Cramer talking about no longer trust. That's a moment. We got to screen cap that or something. Because I remember the Cramer, a lot of folks would often, when Mr. Cramer would talk about it, they'd bet on the opposite. But now that Mr. Cramer has come out talking about the validity of the data, it's a brave new world.
Yeah. I mean, speaking of data, though, that's kind of my shtick. I'm a data nerd. You're a data nerd, too. People may not know, but Thomas Wasson is absolutely a data nerd. And so I take my data very seriously, and I understand that all data is biased and flawed, but understanding those biases and flaws is important and critical to understanding it. But the freight market, I don't know if you lean on flawed or not in terms of where it's at, but I think we can probably get things started with looking at our own data and interpretation.
Let's check it out, because we're definitely in a situation where it's August, it's the doldrums, it's summer, but we got to see we have a few extra stuff coming up. Tee us up. What are we looking at?
Yeah, let's get it off with the market in two. So here we go. So Trade War Command Center, for those of you that are Sonar subscribers, this is kind of where I start looking at a lot of my data to start the day. If you look at the top left, that is the outbound tender volume, or the ocean volume index, the IOTI, down pretty significantly year over year at this point, 13% down. We've run through the air pockets. We've run through the peak season volumes. Not looking great there. Intermodal volume, basically flat. We expect that to follow suit because it's heavily tied to that ocean volume segment. And then we look at the truckload volume. Not a new story here, down 15% year over year. And of course, we're going to talk to Dr. Rogers here in a minute about the Logistics Managers Index and the reads there, all in green, all showing some level of expansion. We'll break that down shortly. The top U.S. gateways, China, up there at the top, showing a pretty strong downturn in overall import volume. Let's go to the next chart, break down the OTVI a little bit here. OTVI, wow, depressing figures, looking like we are actually losing volume. A little bit of seasonality here in August that we tend to see. But man, this is not a great sign for the truckload situation. We go to the next chart here and look at one that's not necessarily as depressing. The outbound tender rejection index actually staying up, and we're up close, 5.2%, still above where we were last year. Really taking on that deterioration, and the demand is not really making capacity really get as loose as that would suggest. So it is always about supply and demand, not just demand alone. Let's go to the next chart. The NTIL, the spot rate index. Look, spot rates are flat year over year. This is excluding fuel. So this is telling us that we're crawling up on the spot market as demand is falling. we're still seeing this upward trend, upward trajectory, and spot rates being flat year over year means that there is some resilience baked into this trucking market.
That's what's remarkable. You look at both of those data sets,
Mhm.
it's almost a tale of two cities. So, on the
Yeah.
contract side, despite the fact that we have lower outbound tender volumes, outbound tender rejection rates are positive on year over year comps. Now, Goldilocks, Watson's rule of Goldilocks says 5% is about just right. So, it's important to put this in context, which is that 2%, 3%, 4%. We're finally in the money where we're kind of at a form of equilibrium, tentatively. 5 to 7%, I say we're looking at some early green shoots. 7 to 10%, I'm starting to see if it's sustained some movement towards positive pricing power. But then we switch gears to the other side, like a Charles Dickens novel. So on one side, we have more favorable conditions in the larger contract space. The larger carriers have also talked about that in their Q2 earnings calls and stuff. We're seeing low single-digit increases. But on the flip side, the spot market rate, let's show that NTI L chart real quick as well for line haul rates. We're still bumping along the bottom. So that's going to be one of the biggest challenges just when we're talking about this macroeconomic data. And we talked about Bureau of Labor statistics and jobs. For the Fed or for Fred who drives a truck, it definitely feels like there's two types of worlds where one side is seeing improving conditions while another side is seeing still a lot of uncertainty.
Yeah, and speaking of Fred who drives a truck, we are actually I'm going to show something here that Sonar, a lot of Sonar data, enterprise level accounts, it's really targeted towards that, but we're actually releasing something in Sonar that is an entry level gateway to a lot of our data. So you can't trust the macro data right now, but we're launching an app called Blue to Blue. This is an old terminology that we've said internally for years now, talking about a reference to a market or a lane that's actually very valuable for a carrier to operate in. Well, now for an entry level price of $9.95 or $9.99 a month, you can get access to Sonar data. And here's just a little snippet screenshot. You can look at rates, you can look at tender data, all high level. There's a rate and there's a chart now that you can look at tender rejection data inside of this app. So a good little entry level point, especially I think, when you talk to a lot of the carriers out there, these smaller fleets and smaller operators, they probably need data the most.
Yep.
Because they don't have their own internal data sets to kind of look at, or they don't know what they're looking at. It's not as homogenized. They'll get a customer here and there that kind of skews their information, but Sonar data is pretty, it has biases, but it's fairly well dispersed across multiple industries. So I think this is probably a good thing for a lot of these smaller operators and smaller businesses who don't necessarily have that enterprise level vibe to them.
Yep. Or the resources
Yeah.
or the cost. I mean, to
Exactly.
get the full suite, I like the fact that the cost is a big deal. Shout out to Adam Wingfield in the playbook.
Yeah.
He's been doing a lot of work for the owner operators. So now Blue to Blue,
Yep.
you can pull it up there and check it out. Use it as another tool.
Yeah,
It's
there's
not
the QR code.
Yeah, check out the QR code. It's not going to be the gospel, but it is a source of truth amongst many, including the load boards and the other providers. And I'm excited. This is going to be really cool because I think the biggest challenge for Sonar data, coming from a Sonar analyst, you and I both talk shop all the time, is that getting folks the ability and the comfort to start looking it up. And then it's like, oh, yeah, here's the confidence score. I can actually make informed decisions on that one that you put. You have a low and a high, and then you have a middle. That's going to be super cool. So, yeah, congratulations to Sonar folks. I used to call it Run the Blues.
Run the Blues. Yeah.
Like Run the Jewels, but
Yeah.
definitely check it out.
Nice. Well, let's transition into our guest of the month, Dr. Z, Dr. Rogers, and let's get into this LMI reading for July. Dr. Z, we were talking about how, we've got some now political noise in our macroeconomic environment that has interjected itself, whether we liked it or not. And it's created a little bit of, it's making it more challenging to read the tea leaves, if you will, of our economic environment. I read this month's LMI, and it was very tariff and policy heavy on some of the stuff. And but the data itself really, I don't know that I saw anything like dramatic in the overt data. I only looked at it at a high level. I'm going to lean on you for the surprises. But I'd really love to hear your overall take on where we're at just currently with the tariffs and the supply chain to get things started.
Sure. Absolutely. And thank you, Thomas, by the way. This show's been on for too long without a Kill a Mike reference. So I appreciated that there.
Got you.
If you were to look at the overall index, just like you said, Zach, there wasn't a lot of huge divergences from where we were in June. And just to remind everybody, any number I say, if it's 50, that means break even. Over 50 is growth. Under 50 is contraction. And the further away it is, faster rate of growth, faster rate of contraction. So the overall index came in at 59.2, which was down just slightly from June, and pretty close to the all-time average, which is now at 61.5 for the index. And, the costs are high still. Inventory costs, for example, came in at 71.9. Now that's down from where they were in June when the numbers are up at 80, but 71.9, that doesn't mean it's going down. It just means it's not going up quite as fast as it was. The other one, and you got it right there, is 55.6 for inventory levels. Now, on its face, expansion at 59.6 55.6, that's not bad. That's sort of where we would want to be in many ways in the middle of the summer. Where you start to see the sort of divergences, as you mentioned, in the in the numbers, are when you split it up versus for upstream and downstream, or for our small versus large respondents. And what we really see, and this has been now a trend for the last 3 months, is that upstream firms, so I'm talking wholesalers, distributors, 3PLs, LSPs, things like that, are holding huge quantities of inventory. And so are smaller firms. And there's some crossover with smaller firms and distributors and stuff like that. And by extension, have much higher costs, much tighter capacity. And it's due to some of the changes and the uncertainty that's been injected in trade policy. Trust me, I would prefer to write. I like writing the LMI when I don't have to use the word tariff. That is my preference. But unfortunately, right now, there's no way to do that. And so if we just split apart, say upstream and downstream firms actually saw inventories contract at 47.6. Now their costs are still very high. Inventory costs downstream are 76.2. So they're about 30 points apart, 29 points apart. And what that tells you is retailers have a lot of inventory on hand that's sitting. It's sort of static, and they're trying to run it down as quickly as they can. Their upstream partners' inventory levels came in at 58.5, so there's some expansion there. Their inventory costs are at 71. Their warehouse capacity is at 46. Warehouse price at 69.7. Again, these are all upstream numbers. And what that tells you is things are still coming into the country or being manufactured or whatever's happening. They're just not moving down to the retail level because retailers are really trying to burn off the large sort of quantities of inventory we brought in the beginning of the year. I just the folks at the Port of LA were nice and let me come on a webinar yesterday with them, and Gene Sirocco, who's the director over there, said that July is the busiest month they've ever had in the 117 years that the Port of LA has been accepting cargo. This July was the busiest they've ever had, but we haven't seen that inventory really go down to the retail level for the most part. What's happened is it's come into the country and it's kind of sitting in the middle mile. Those are upstream firms. They're also smaller firms. We break out our respondents for firms with more than 1,000 and less than 1,000 employees. Inventory levels for those smaller firms, 64.8. That's a really fast rate of expansion for inventories. Large firms are 49. So there, again, we're seeing some contraction there. And what's happening is essentially we had to pull all this stuff forward as fast as we can. And most indications that I'm seeing say that we've already pulled forward everything we're going to need for this year, or most everything we're going to need for this year. At the Port of LA yesterday, they said, June and July were amazing months. August is going to be a little slower. September probably going to be a little slower as well. And so all this stuff is now pulled forward. It's sort of sitting in the middle of the supply chain with these smaller firms. And I would imagine sometime in September, we'll see it start to matriculate down to retail firms. Retailers like to sort of have inventories peak around maybe mid-October. Mm-hmm. But looking forward at some of the indicators, we had this big rush this year. Stay ahead of the I won't use the T word of trade policy. But for next year, it really remains unclear what policies are going to be, partly because we just don't know what the rules are going to be. I think we had our 5th China tariff extension the other day. So I think we could go for 6 probably in November. So right now it sort of seems like the firms we talk to, you're betting against the fact that the tariffs will really kick in. And right now that's been sort of a winning bet.
So, I mean, I think one of the things I get asked a lot are, especially concerning the back half of the year, I think a lot of companies are really struggling. Like right now, we're talking a lot of supply chain management strategy, where, companies have been pulling forward. If we can pull up the IOTI here, I think it corroborates just about everything you just talked about. We saw this huge surge of imports. Now, this is a far more erratic IOTI than we traditionally would see. And it's a big statement considering the last several years, but you can see Gene Soroka's point about July was a banner month because you had this simultaneous makeup of lost time in May for where they weren't importing stuff because of the 145% tariff. And then they also had a little bit of a pull forward, which has waned. We were outperforming last year, which was a banner year for imports, for a minute. And now we're back below 2023. Now the comps get a little challenging for 2023 in the second half, but still, I think everything you just talked about, we've pulled all this freight into the country. We're ready for retail peak season later in the year, but are the consumers going to show up later in the year? And I think that's one of the things that's sort of reflected in the LMI inventory levels, where this 55 seems like a kind of a middling number for inventory management. Am I right in that?
I think so. And retailers specifically are keeping things very lean.
Yeah.
Because they really don't want to get caught. You mentioned 2023 was such a slow year. That's because they got caught in 2022 with way too much inventory. Because we pulled forward and inflation hit and then we couldn't move it. And they're terrified to repeat that. And really small firms, especially that aren't able to absorb it, are terrified about it. So I think you're right. Now, if you look at, say, Prime Day was pretty good. We were up 30% year over year, Prime Day. Now it was also 50% longer, but we were up 30% in terms of sales. And we have seen, back to school hasn't been a flop by any means. Kids are still going to school. My kid, first day of school today. And now we did though see apparel a little more expensive, some toys more expensive. So we are starting to see the goods get more expensive. That Prime Day number, which is up 30%, great. A lot of that stuff was already in the country sort of before April, before Liberation Day and the tariffs really took off. Things that have come in between April and now, even though it's not 180% tariffs or whatever, it's still effectively 40 to 50% from China, 50% Brazil, 50% India, 25% Mexico and Canada, 15% Japan. And so there is additional cost baked in. And so I don't think that we can use consumer spending patterns in sort of the summer as accurate a predictor of consumer spending patterns in fall and winter, especially in the holiday season, as we normally can. Looking forward, and I think you sort of alluded to this, we always ask, like, all right, future numbers, where do you see this going in 12 months? And it's so interesting because, inventories are at 55 right now. Future predictions for inventories over the next 12 months are 56.7. That's pretty consistent with where we are, and shows like, we're building inventories up somewhat, but not crazy, which shows that probably there's not going to be any big surges in consumer spending. And then if you add on top of that, inventory costs are 75.3, warehousing price is 74.7, and transportation price is 75.5. So that comes out to like 225 cumulative. Anytime that we're in the 220s, it's been inflationary. And it really links to supply side inflation. Now, it's not the 240 that we were at in late 21 and early 22 when inflation was crazy, but to be in the 220s does suggest some inflation. And so when you put those two numbers together, moderate inventories, but crazy out of the box, pretty significant price growth. What that suggests to me is that firms, our respondents, are betting the tariffs might not be finished business 12 months from now. And even if they are, it's unlikely that a significant amount of manufacturing will have come back to the United States. One, it just, you can't move it that quickly. And even if you could, there's tariffs on all the components, so it would still be relatively expensive. And so what it looks like basically is lower expectations a little bit for inventories, raise expectations for costs, and we're just going to swallow some costs. And by we, I mean companies, their customers, maybe consumers as well. We're going to swallow these costs over the next year. And what that means in terms of volume, I would not expect to see another June and July at the ports and then associated outbound volumes coming out of California for the next who knows how long. Basically until this is settled business.
I was a really good conversation with an importer who gets home goods stuff, decor for Halloween, Christmas, and stuff. They placed their orders a year in advance, and they said the exact same thing that your data was talking about. Was we're just going to absorb the first year. This year is a wash. We're going to eat the cost, and if we figure out a deal next year, then I'm going to have to come up with how are we going to pass this along? How are we going to actually haggle it out? And that's kind of one of the questions I wanted to ask in terms of the transportation segment, because there is a really fascinating difference between capacity upstream and downstream, and then utilization and prices. It is very fascinating to see on your data sets that it looks like the upstream is heating up more than the downstream in certain areas. When we're talking about that, give us a little brief thought. Is there anything meaningful to that? Because for folks looking at our spot rate data, we're kind of in the summer doldrums right now.
Yeah, so currently we see upstream utilization 60.7 and downstream's at 50. So downstream is like break even right now. It's 10.7 points lower, and that is statistically significant. And again, what that I think suggests is that our retailers are just sitting on this inventory like a bird sitting on an egg. It's not going anywhere. We're just sitting on it. Upstream is actually the ones who are moving things around, which is why I think you're seeing a little more activity up there. That being said, prices are still high. We still see price growth in the 60s, which is solid, but it's muted. It's not the type of expansion we probably would have expected coming into this year for peak season. We were really, if you look at our future predictions from this time last year, they were like upper 60s, low 70s, and instead we're in the low 60s, and that really does reflect, I think, some stagnated growth. Now, if we go forward, however, and look at future transportation, it actually looks relatively robust. So downstream, this is for their future predictions. Transportation capacity comes in at 47.6. Transportation price is at 66.7. That's a positive freight inversion that says that, yeah, prices will be higher. The cost of everything will be higher, but we'll be moving things at least quickly. And what I think that reflects is hope that if we do settle on the rules, whatever they are, even if the rules say that everything's going to be more expensive, once those are in place, we won't have the kind of start-stop movements that you just showed a minute ago. It'll be smooth. And when it's smooth, then we can have sort of continual utilization of fleets, which leads to a better market. It's one of those things like, slow is smooth and smooth is fast. We would rather have sort of smooth utilization of assets without the crazy highs and lows that we've had this year. Because ultimately for the freight market, consistency is more attractive than spikes and troughs.
I got a really good question the other day that I wanted to throw at you, and it was regarding like the new like organizational strategy around, as tariffs are getting implemented and changed. What is this going to do to trade lanes in the United States and North America? Really, are we going to start to see, is California going to lose a little bit of volume here? Are we going to start to see some shifts in the way that we traditionally see transportation flow in the country because of these tariffs? I know we've got a 90-day pause on China again, which is obviously the dominant flow of freight, where it comes in from China, goes to ports of Los Angeles, Long Beach, and then goes up to Chicago, rail merger, ignoring that for a minute, but then it gets distributed across the East Coast, especially around the holidays. Do you see anything that would structurally shift that here in the near term?
Not in the near term.
Yeah.
Not in the near term, because you can't make any large structural shifts in a environment of uncertainty.
Right.
Take Apple. 14% of iPhones are now made in India. That was the number from 2024. The message was clear after COVID. Hey, China plus one, diversify from China. Okay, Apple put a significant amount of resources in moving that. Now we have a 50% tariff on India that sort of came out of nowhere. Is Apple really going to now spend all that money to bring stuff back in the United States? Not in the near term. And even if they did, they still need the components from China and Japan and Korea and all over the place that will have those additional costs. And so, no, my answer right now is no. You might see some movements, but the question would be, where do we move it to? Do we move it to Mexico? Well, does the USMCA exist anymore? I don't know. Do we move it into the United States? Sure, we're relatively close to full employment, though. And if we're in the United States, we're still paying all these tariffs on components. I could get a Japanese car in here right now for 15% tariff on Japan. Or I could build a car in the United States with 50% on the batteries from China, with 25 to 30% on all the components from Korea or from Mexico and Canada, 50% on the aluminum, 50% on the semiconductors. I need about 1,000 semiconductors in a new car. I might just go and import the car from Japan because all that other stuff is a lot to figure out. And so I think if there was some certainty around the tariffs, and if they weren't disproportionately affecting components versus finished goods, I do think we would see shifts where we have more domestic manufacturing in the United States. But as of right now, there's just too much uncertainty for anybody to make the big investments that would be required for us to significantly shift the sort of routes internally.
Do you think the big beautiful bill gives any boost to that stimulus? Because that's another question I get asked.
I mean, I know stock buybacks are up, so it's giving a boost to that.
Fair point.
Well, kind of thinking any other structural shifts when we're looking at in the data. I'm kind of curious. Did you have any thoughts on this the rail stuff or any of the LMI? You think we'll see any changes in transportation prices in the next year or two if this rail stuff goes in?
I think having a coast to coast rail is probably beneficial. Because it probably cuts out some times. The two things you want in terms of decreasing transportation costs are economies of scale and economies of distance. The more you can put on the car, the further it can go, the more efficient it's going to be. So I ultimately think it's a good thing. And I think there's still enough competition that I'm not that worried about a monopolistic sort of price gouging campaign, right. Because it's not just that the rails are competing against each other. There's OTR, we can come around on a boat on the other side. I mean, if they really start gouging, fine, I'll go through the Panama Canal and come on the other side. So I'm not as worried about, because there's so many modes that can go across the country, I'm not that worried about it. I think generally it's going to be positive. That was the initial plan when Grant was hammering in the spike up in Utah, was to have something that goes across the country. So I think it's generally positive. Of course, it remains to be seen. There could be some things that I'm not thinking of, but no, I think it'll, stuff comes in the West and goes East. And if that makes it smoother, there's some benefits to that.
All fair enough. Stuff. Are you done with your summer vacation, or are we
back
winded down?
Monday.
Oh man, look at you. Are you ready to go? You got a bunch of students ready in the chute?
I mean, I'm not ready, but look, I don't just talk about JIT, I live it. I'll be ready on Monday.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for keeping us updated on the LMI this month. We will talk to you again in September-ish, somewhere in there. If we can squeeze this into your schedule. You got the same schedule, or?
Yeah, I'm teaching Tuesdays, Thursdays, but I had them push my classes back to 11 Mountain so that I could,
look at you.
So I could make my Freightonomics.
So you know where your priorities are, and thank you so much for that. And I am excited for the September reading of the LMI. I think it'll be I think we're going to learn some stuff about tariffs and some of this inflation.
Maybe it'll be a September to remember.
Look at you.
Damn.
So clever. I need to have you write my titles. Well, thank you everybody for tuning in this week. We'll be back in 2 weeks and then again in a month. Have a good one.